A millionaire wakes up in a hospital bed after a brutal accident, and the nurse at his side leans in and whispers something that shatters his world. "I am your daughter." Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The morning sun shimmered across the polished hood of the charcoal gray sports car as Adrian Blackwood guided it down the winding coastal highway just outside San Francisco. He was the kind of man everyone recognized from the glossy covers of business magazines, a self-made millionaire who had built an empire from the ground up. His estate was rumored to sprawl across acres of clifftop property, but the truth was that Adrian rarely spent much time at home. For him, success was an endless pursuit of new ventures, new challenges, and new ways to prove to the world that he was a man capable of shaping his destiny. On that fateful day, the sky was a brilliant blue, the ocean sparkling below like a promise of endless possibility. Adrian felt invincible behind the wheel, the engine's roar like a symphony of triumph. He was on his way to finalize a major deal that would expand his holdings into international markets. He had spent weeks negotiating with overseas partners, wearing down their skepticism until all that remained was their admiration for his business acumen. As he drove, he allowed a rare smile to crease his lips. Life was moving exactly according to his plan. There was nothing he couldn't handle, or so he believed. No one could have predicted how quickly a single second of distraction could unravel that sense of absolute control. The ringing of his phone broke through the rumble of the engine, a subtle vibration that lured his gaze away from the road. In that fleeting moment, Adrian failed to notice the sharp turn ahead. By the time he looked up, it was too late. The squeal of tires on asphalt, the panicked grip on the steering wheel, the sickening sound of metal scraping against the guardrail, it all blended into a jarring cacophony of terror. The momentum launched the car over the edge. In the horrifying seconds that followed, Adrian felt weightless and eerily slow free fall before a violent crash shattered his consciousness. When he finally came to, the world was blurred by pain and the sting of antiseptic. Fluorescent lights flickered above him in a sterile white hospital room where machines beeped in a monotonous rhythm. The pounding in his head was relentless, each heartbeat echoing like a drum in his temples. For a moment he couldn't remember who he was or how he had ended up here. Fear coursed through him, a primal dread that took hold even before he could form a coherent thought. Was he paralyzed? Was he alive? Or trapped in some kind of feverish nightmare? He tried to move, but the slightest shift sent fiery jolts of agony up his spine. A figure moved into his field of vision, clad in pale blue scrubs. She looked young, perhaps no older than 20, but her eyes held a quiet confidence that suggested she had seen more pain and suffering than many twice her age. Her hair was pulled into a neat bun, a few stray wisps brushing her forehead, and her expression was equal parts concern and relief. Something about her presence felt disconcertingly familiar, as if Adrian had glimpsed those warm brown eyes somewhere in the haze of his lost memories. "Hello, Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice soft but steady. "You're in the hospital. You've been unconscious for 3 days after your car accident. We weren't sure when you would wake up, but it's good to see you finally open your eyes." Confusion knotted in Adrian's mind like a tangled thread. The doctors must have known who he was. Maybe they recognized his face from the news or from business profiles, but why did this nurse speak to him with such a personal tone? He tried to respond, but his throat felt raw, as if sand had been scraped down his esophagus. An unintelligible croak escaped his lips instead of words. She offered a small, sympathetic smile. "Don't try to talk yet," she said gently. "We had to intubate you after the surgery and your throat's still recovering. I'm Nurse Eliana. I've been looking after you since you arrived." Her gaze flicked over to the bag of intravenous fluids, the beeping heart monitor, the oxygen tube snaking beneath his nose. "Everything's looking stable for now, but let me call the doctor and let him know you're awake." For a moment, Adrian closed his eyes, attempting to gather the fragments of memory scattered like broken glass in his mind. He remembered the roar of the engine, the sharp curve, the brief terrifying flight through the air, and then darkness. Nothing else. The swirling confusion disoriented him. He wanted to demand answers, but the pain that throbbed through his body held him in check. As he blinked, the nurse stepped away, presumably to notify the rest of the medical staff. He tried to piece together the events leading to the crash, but the more he strained, the more the recollection seemed to slip away like water through his fingers. The doctor arrived, a tall man with graying hair and a measured step. After a brief evaluation, he explained that Adrian had sustained multiple fractures, bruised ribs, and a severe concussion. They had performed emergency surgery to mend internal bleeding. The next few weeks at least would be spent recovering in the hospital, followed by physical therapy. It was a bleak picture, one that Adrian had never envisioned for himself. He had always been the unstoppable force, the man who bent the world to his will. The notion of lying in bed, dependent on strangers for even the simplest tasks, felt like a humbling torment. Nurse Eliana hovered nearby, adjusting his pillows, checking his vitals, smoothing the sheet draped over his bandaged torso. Each time their eyes met, an electric tension sparked within him, as if a question hovered in the air unasked. She was kind, but there was something else in her gaze, an emotion that went beyond professional concern. It was as though she was wrestling with a secret that weighed heavily on her shoulders. He wondered if it was pity or if perhaps she was just a caretaker who took her duties seriously. But in the back of his mind, a faint alarm bell rang. There was more to her presence in his room. The next day brought more tests and more monotony. Adrian scrolled absently through news feeds on his phone, which had been retrieved by the hospital staff. Business deals stalled without his oversight. Urgent messages from his board flooded his inbox. The world he had built so carefully was moving on without him, and the sense of helplessness frustrated him. He tried to manage crises from his bed, firing off instructions when he had the energy, but his mind was sluggish from medication and pain. Nothing felt right. In some ways, it was a relief when Nurse Eliana came in to gently remind him that rest was more important than responding to every corporate meltdown. Strangely, he found himself listening to her. One late afternoon, after most of the staff had done their rounds and the corridor lights had been dimmed to match the evening hush, Eliana quietly entered his room. He noticed her hesitant steps, the way she seemed to steel herself before taking a seat by his bedside. "Mr. Blackwood," she began in a voice that trembled just slightly, "do you have a moment to talk?" A swirl of anxiety curled in the pit of Adrian's stomach. The seriousness in her tone unsettled him. He nodded, wincing at the pull on his bruised neck muscles. "Is something wrong?" He managed to rasp his voice, still not entirely steady. Her lips pressed together, forming a thin line of resolve. "I don't know how to say this except to be direct." She drew in a shaky breath. "I'm not just your nurse. I'm your daughter." The words shattered the hush of the hospital room, slicing through the sterile air like lightning across a dark sky. Adrian stared at her in a state of raw disbelief. Daughter. The word felt foreign on his tongue. It echoed in his mind until it became a meaningless sound. Confusion, denial, a flicker of anger all churned inside him as he tried to reconcile the reality of the statement with everything he thought he knew about his own life. How could he have a daughter? How could she be old enough to stand before him with such resolute calm in her gaze? His chest felt tight, as if a giant fist had closed around his heart. He tried to speak, but the storm of emotion robbed him of coherent words. For years, he had told himself there was no time for a family, no space in his carefully orchestrated schedule for children. He had never married, never considered the possibility that there might be a lost piece of himself out in the world. Yet here she was, claiming to be his flesh and blood. The shock was so profound that for a moment, all he could do was stare at her. the silence growing thick with the weight of everything that remained unsaid. Nurse Eliana looked equally shaken, though she clutched her composure with a discipline that suggested she had rehearsed this moment in her mind for a very long time. "I know you have questions. I don't expect you to believe me immediately." "But I couldn't hide it any longer," she said, her voice quivering with barely restrained emotion. There were tears threatening to fall from her eyes, tears she was fighting to keep at bay. Adrian finally found his voice, though it emerged in a strangled whisper. "What do you mean you're my daughter?" "I would have known. I would have." His words faltered under the weight of his own uncertainty. An image flashed in his memory, a fleeting recollection of a woman from long ago, someone who had been a brief but intense presence in his life. No, he thought that was impossible. He pushed the memory away, refusing to let himself consider that there had been consequences he had never even imagined. Eliana's gaze flickered with sorrow. "You didn't know," she answered softly, "but I promise you, I'm telling the truth. And I can prove it. I have the papers. I have everything." Her voice broke just enough to reveal how difficult this confession was for her. "I never wanted to spring this on you, especially not when you're injured. But I couldn't stand by any longer." The reality was overwhelming, as if Adrian's entire sense of self had been ripped open. He had survived a crash that should have taken his life, only to wake up and discover a daughter he never knew existed. The illusions of control that had once framed his existence now lay shattered at his feet. And as he looked at the determined set of Eliana's chin, he realized that no matter how desperately he wanted to deny it, nothing would ever be the same again. Adrian stared at Nurse Eliana, the revelation echoing in the hush of the hospital room. His mind felt split into jagged pieces. Pain flared behind his eyes, and he realized he was still too weak to unleash the torrent of questions hammering at his skull. He settled for staring at the young woman who had just claimed she was his daughter, trying to grasp a fact that made no sense in the context of his tightly controlled life. Eliana looked back at him, her posture rigid, her hands folded as if she was trying to keep them from trembling. She gave him time to absorb the shock, though her face flickered with anxiety. For a moment, the distant beep of the heart monitor was the only sound. Finally, Adrian drew in a shuddering breath. "How?" he managed to whisper. His throat still burned from the aftermath of the intubation. Every breath he took reminded him of his fractured ribs. But none of that physical pain compared to the jolt of uncertainty raging inside him. Her response came in a halting tone, as if every word was pulled from a wound. "When I was a little girl, my mother told me your name. She said you had no idea I existed, that the two of you parted ways before she realized she was pregnant. She tried to reach you once, but by then you'd moved on. She never heard back, and she decided to raise me alone." Eliana swallowed, her expression tensing. "I don't blame you. You couldn't have known. But I always promised myself that if I had the chance, I would tell you in person." Adrian tried to speak, but his voice caught in his chest. Memories flickered. Faces, parties, deals. The unstoppable climb that had swallowed his 20s and 30s. He had been involved with a few women over the years, but none he'd stayed with for long. He recalled a whirlwind affair with a beautiful, free-spirited artist named Carmen. Her laughter had been bright, fleeting, an unexpected break in his otherwise relentless schedule. They had spent a few intense months together, but she had vanished one day, leaving him half sure it was because he'd never slowed down enough to see her properly. Could Eliana possibly be Carmen's child? He coughed softly, trying to tame the swirl of questions. "Your mother's name," he finally managed. "Was it Carmen?" Eliana nodded, relief and sorrow flickering in her eyes. "Yes. She died 3 years ago. Cancer. It was sudden, and by the time she was diagnosed, it was too late for any meaningful treatment." A stab of guilt shot through Adrian's heart. He remembered Carmen's lively spirit, How she had pressed him to take a weekend off and go hiking. How she'd teased him about living only for boardrooms and spreadsheets. Then he remembered how easily he had let her slip away, telling himself they wanted different lives. Had she tried to contact him after she left? Had there been a letter he never opened? A call he'd ignored? He felt the weight of regret settle in his chest. "I'm sorry," he said hoarsely, though he wasn't entirely sure what he was apologizing for not being there for Carmen, for Eliana's loss, or for the years he hadn't known about his daughter's existence. Eliana's gaze softened. "I don't want your apology," she said gently. "I only told you this because I couldn't lie, not when you were so vulnerable, and not when it's something you deserve to know." Silence expanded between them again. Adrian tried to marshal his thoughts into something coherent, but his mind kept stumbling. He was a man who prided himself on planning, on reading people, on controlling outcomes, yet he could never have planned for a revelation like this. The father he never thought he'd become was now faced with a daughter already grown, a daughter who had sat by his side, caring for him, before telling him who she was. Finally, he gestured stiffly toward the chair by his bedside. "Sit," he said. "Tell me everything." Eliana settled onto the seat, looking both relieved to be invited and wary of what might follow. She explained how her mother had refused to let bitterness consume her, how Carmen had said Adrian was too driven to notice the subtle changes in her health and emotions back then, and that she didn't want to tether him to something he hadn't asked for. She had left the city quietly, moving in with an old friend and eventually finding modest work. By the time Eliana was born, Carmen had accepted they would manage on their own. "My mother refused to speak ill of you," Eliana said. "She never wanted me to think of myself as unwanted. She just said you were too busy chasing your dreams. She always insisted you'd have been there if you knew." She held on to that hope. Adrian closed his eyes, absorbing the difficult truth. Carmen had loved him enough not to poison his child against him, but she also hadn't given him the chance to choose whether he wanted to be part of Eliana's life. Or maybe she had tried once and failed, but that unanswered plea had condemned them both to years of separation. It was too big to process. His injuries, the dull ache in his skull, the swirl of memory, it all merged into a storm of remorse. When he opened his eyes, Eliana was regarding him with gentle caution. "You don't have to decide anything now," she said quietly. "I know this is a shock. You need time to heal. I'll be here as your nurse, whatever else happens." Her words sank into him, forming a fragile tether of comfort he hadn't expected. Though he was still reeling, some part of him recognized that Eliana hadn't demanded anything. She had merely told him the truth and then left the next steps in his hands. That act of forbearance was strangely humbling. He nodded, swallowing the knot in his throat. "All right," he said. "Thank you for telling me." Eliana stood, smoothing her scrubs as she took a step back from the bed. The tension in her shoulders was still visible, but a hint of relief shone in her eyes. "Rest," she instructed gently. "I'll be back on rounds in a little while. If you need anything, press the call button." She slipped out of the room, leaving Adrian alone with his thoughts. He sank deeper into the pillows, exhaustion creeping into every muscle. At any other time in his life, he would have called his personal assistant, arranged for immediate damage control, demanded a thorough investigation. But for once he lacked the will. The raw ache of uncertainty hung too heavily over him. Instead, he let his eyes drift shut, lulled by the steady beep of the monitor and the distant hum of corridor activity. He slept fitfully, haunted by patchwork dreams of Carmen, her dark eyes, her mischievous smile, her voice telling him he spent too many hours imprisoned by ambition. Then images of Eliana blurred into his dreams, wearing the same pained resolve he'd seen when she told him the truth. Each time he jolted awake, he found himself both relieved and unsettled to realize he was in the same hospital bed, the same predicament, the same new reality. Days slipped by. Adrian's body mended in increments, fractures healing, bruises fading, but his mind remained a battlefield of questions and regret. Eliana came regularly, performing her duties with meticulous care and occasional warmth. She never pressed him to talk about their connection, never forced the topic of fatherhood upon him. Yet she no longer hid the compassion in her voice when she asked how he was feeling, and he no longer felt the urge to keep his walls impenetrable. Small bridges were forming between them, though he wasn't sure if they would hold under the weight of the past. When a week had passed, the doctor informed Adrian that he was showing steady improvement. "If things continue like this," the doctor said, "we can move you from intensive monitoring to a regular recovery ward. After that, you might be discharged within 2 or 3 weeks. Adrian heard the words, but couldn't summon the usual sense of relief. Going home meant confronting the chaos waiting for him outside the hospital doors. Business partners, press inquiries, unfinished contracts. The list went on. It also meant returning to an empty mansion and facing the realization that he wasn't as alone in the world as he had once believed. That evening, Adrian asked Eliana to stay a moment after her official duties were done. She paused by the door, one hand resting on the handle. "Yes?" He forced himself to meet her gaze. I want to talk more," he said, his voice rough. "Not here, maybe not right now, but soon. I'd like to know more about you, how you grew up, who you've become, and about your mother, please." A flicker of grateful surprise illuminated Eliana's features. She nodded slowly, stepping away from the door. "Of course," she said. "Whenever you're ready, just let me know. I've been waiting for you to ask." He couldn't quite form a smile, but his next breath felt lighter. As she left, a strange mix of fear and relief collided inside him. He was a man who once believed he had to control every aspect of his life, but now he felt an unfamiliar pull toward surrender, letting events unfold, allowing himself to be vulnerable enough to discover who his daughter truly was. Lying back against the pillows, he stared at the pale glow of the hallway lights creeping beneath the room's closed door. This place had once felt oppressive, a prison of forced recovery. Now it felt like a fragile sanctuary where, for just a little longer, he could adjust to the idea that he was someone's father. Soon enough, he would have to step beyond these walls. How he navigated that future, whether he embraced or fled from this remarkable young woman who had been thrust into his life, would define the man he chose to be. Adrian woke the next morning to a dull ache radiating across his ribs and a faint knock on the door. He blinked against the harsh fluorescent light, feeling the heaviness of his bandaged body, the tug of the IV line taped to his arm. In a week's time, the routine had become both claustrophobic and oddly comforting. His entire world had narrowed to this room with its lingering odor of antiseptic, the hum of machines, and the regular visits from the medical staff. As he propped himself up against the pillows, he wondered what new revelation the day would bring. The conversation with Eliana echoed in his mind, each word a reminder that everything he once believed about his life was shifting. But if he was honest with himself, he no longer felt just raw confusion. A cautious sense of curiosity had begun to take shape, the first stirrings of a desire to understand who Eliana truly was and how the two of them might fit into each other's lives. The day's first visitor was a physical therapist assigned to evaluate his condition. She entered with brisk efficiency, pulling back the sheets to check his range of motion. Adrian grit his teeth through the discomfort, determined not to show weakness. Once she was satisfied he could begin a routine of gentle exercises, she left him with printed instructions and a promise to return the following day. He stared at the diagrams, each one depicting a movement he needed to practice in bed: ankle rotations, shoulder lifts, and slow, deliberate breathing to help expand his lungs. It was a stark difference from the grueling but exhilarating pace of his normal life. Here, every small success, like bending his knee without excruciating pain, felt monumental. By mid-morning, Eliana stepped in, carrying a tray with fresh water and a small container of pills. She offered him a polite smile, but there was a hint of tension in her eyes. Though they had agreed to talk, they'd had little chance to do so beyond the standard nurse-patient interactions. Adrian had spent most of the previous day either sleeping or slogging through emails from anxious investors. She waited as he swallowed the pills, then took note of his vitals, scribbling on her chart with practiced precision. He watched her hand, how steady it was, how carefully she documented each piece of data. She was so self-assured in this realm, comfortable in the identity she had forged for herself. "How are you feeling today?" she asked quietly, her tone professional yet laced with concern. Adrian considered the question, sensing she meant more than just his physical state. "I'm improving," he answered, setting the plastic water cup aside. "Both inside and out, I suppose." Something in Eliana's posture softened, as though she recognized the undercurrent of acknowledgement in his words. "That's good," she said. "I was hoping we could talk later if you're up for it." Adrian gave a small nod, mindful that even this gesture caused a dull throb in his neck. "Yes, please. After your shift ends, perhaps?" She hesitated, then agreed. "I'll come back around 7. We can chat without all these distractions." The day crawled by in its usual slow pattern of tests, short walks down the corridor, where a nurse hovered to ensure he didn't collapse, and more naps than he cared to admit needing. He found that the older gentleman in the next room sometimes shuffled past with his IV stand, nodding a silent greeting. Occasionally, the distant sound of a child crying reminded Adrian how many lives intersected in a place like this. It was a stark contrast to his fortress-like mansion, where only the selected few ever passed through the gates. The hospital, for all its inconveniences, reminded him that he was part of a broader human tapestry, fragile, vulnerable, and no longer able to pretend he stood above the messy complexities of ordinary life. By early evening, he was dozing when he heard footsteps that were neither hurried nor timid. Eliana's presence had become familiar to him in a way that both comforted and unsettled him. She approached his bed, wearing jeans and a simple blouse instead of her scrubs. The shift in her appearance underscored that this wasn't a nurse's visit. This was personal. "I'm finished for the day," she said. "Is now a good time?" Adrian nodded. "Yes, please. Have a seat." She settled into the chair at his bedside, folding her hands in her lap. Her posture was tense, as if she were bracing herself. Adrian shifted, trying to find a comfortable position where the pain in his ribs wasn't too sharp. "I'm still processing," he began, voice low, "that I have a daughter. It's..." He paused, searching for the right word. "Overwhelming." Eliana's lips curved into a sad half-smile. "I understand. It was overwhelming for me too, growing up with the knowledge that my father was out there, but never having a clue if we'd ever meet." She began to speak in a measured way, revealing slivers of her childhood, living in a cramped apartment in a less affluent neighborhood, watching her mother juggle multiple jobs, and learning to be independent from a young age. She described Carmen's warmth, the late-night laughter they shared over cups of tea, and the colorful stories of the time spent with Adrian, painted in the most optimistic hues. "Mom never let me resent you," Eliana admitted, her eyes distant with memory. "Whenever I asked why you weren't around, she would say that life had different paths for people, and maybe our paths would cross one day. She said you were driven, brilliant. She never accused you of abandoning us. She believed you simply didn't know." Adrian's throat tightened. He pictured Carmen's gentle smile, the faint dimple in her cheek, when she teased him about being married to his work. "I suppose that's true," he murmured. "I can't say I would have welcomed the news back then. I was too focused on my ambitions, but knowing you existed, that might have changed me." Eliana offered a slight shrug. "It changed me every day. I grew up imagining this stranger who was half of me. Some days I hated you for not being there. Other days I made up stories about how you were searching for us, or how you'd come to rescue us if we ever needed it. Eventually I realized those dreams were just my way of coping." Her words pierced Adrian's composure. He tried to breathe, but the sorrow in her voice made the air feel thicker. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know it's not enough, but I truly am sorry." Eliana nodded, blinking back a sheen of tears. "Mom got sick during my senior year of high school. By then I had a partial scholarship to a local college, but the bills piled up. I took on night shifts at a diner, and after she passed, I needed a career that would let me help others the way I'd wished someone could have helped her. So I pursued nursing." A hush fell between them. Adrian's mind conjured painful images of Carmen fighting cancer alone, her teenage daughter at her side. Had there been any alternative if Carmen had successfully contacted him? He felt a twist of guilt, a sense of helplessness that all these years of success and millions in the bank had done nothing for the two people who should have mattered more than anything else. "If I had known," he began, though the thought remained unfinished. He saw no point in making promises about the past. What mattered now was the present. "You know," he said, steeling his voice, "I don't want us to linger in regret. Tell me what I can do to move forward. I want to support you, be in your life, if that's something you want." The question seemed to startle Eliana. She twisted her fingers together, her gaze drifting to the bland hospital floor tiles. "That's complicated," she admitted. "I've spent most of my life imagining a father I never met. Now I see you in the flesh, and it's confusing. Part of me wants to run away so I won't get hurt. Another part of me wants to know you better." Adrian took a careful breath, mindful of his healing ribs. "I can't promise I won't make mistakes," he said, "but I don't want to lose any more time. Once I'm out of here, we could start with small things. Lunch, maybe a walk in the city. I need to learn who you are, and I'd like you to know me beyond the headlines, that is, if you'll let me." Eliana studied his face, searching for sincerity, and then she nodded. "All right," she said softly. "We'll try, but no pressure, okay?" Adrian's lips curved in the closest thing to a genuine smile he'd managed since the accident. "No pressure," he agreed. They spoke a little longer about mundane topics, her experiences at the hospital, her favorite coffee shop, and how she found solace in reading mystery novels. Each detail wove a slender thread into the tapestry of their relationship, new and delicate, but not impossible to strengthen. Eventually, her phone buzzed with a reminder that she needed to leave. She said her goodbyes and slipped out, leaving Adrian with a mixture of relief and longing. He was still uncertain of how they would navigate this bond, but at least a door had opened. As he drifted off to sleep, he clung to that fragile hope that they might learn to face the unknown together. Over the next few days, Adrian gradually settled into the rhythms of hospital life, though the process felt both humbling and disorienting. His physical therapist guided him through gentle exercises that left him exhausted, but also oddly satisfied. Each morning, he'd manage a slightly longer walk down the corridor, leaning on a wheeled IV stand for support while a watchful nurse hovered nearby. His world had shrunk to a handful of fluorescent-lit hallways and the soft beep of machines, yet for all its confines, he began to realize there were lessons in vulnerability he had never allowed himself to learn before. His business associates started sending well wishes, some perfunctory and others more genuine. The avalanche of emails never ceased. Several of Adrian's top-level executives wanted urgent video calls to discuss how to stabilize investor confidence in the wake of his incapacitation. Though he attempted to respond in measured doses, the lines on the hospital's phone screen blurred after a few minutes, and he found himself increasingly drained. Oddly enough, a part of him sensed relief. For once, he couldn't march into his offices and steer the ship with an iron hand. Circumstances had forced him into letting others take the helm, a shift that both frightened and, in a quiet corner of his soul, liberated him. In the midst of that unraveling, Eliana became a steady presence he looked forward to. Even when she wasn't officially on duty, she would slip into his room with coffee from the vending machine or a contraband pastry she'd snuck past the dietary restrictions. They spoke about ordinary things more than about the larger truths looming over them. It was easier to talk about the comedic show she was binge-watching or the best takeout in the city than to plumb the depths of the past. Yet each seemingly casual conversation had a gravity all its own, building a fragile closeness that Adrian found himself both craving and fearing. One afternoon, as he was attempting to read a financial report on his tablet, Eliana arrived in a plain gray cardigan instead of her usual medical scrubs. She knocked softly on the open door and smiled. "You seem busy," she said. "Should I come back later?" Adrian set the tablet aside, grateful for the interruption. "Actually, I could use a break," he replied. "Come in. I'm drowning in numbers." She approached, taking the chair by his bed. "I know that world is important to you," she said, gesturing at the data on his screen. "But remember, you're supposed to rest." Adrian gave a rueful shrug. "Resting has never been my strong suit." She tilted her head, studying him for a moment. "I gathered that," she said softly, then handed him a small paper bag. "Here, you must be sick of hospital meals." Inside was a fresh croissant, flaky and golden, with the faintest hint of chocolate. The warmth in that simple gesture struck Adrian, and he hesitated before thanking her. "You didn't have to do this," he murmured, breaking off a piece and tasting it. The sweetness melted on his tongue, a small reminder of ordinary pleasures. Eliana offered a half smile. "I guess I just wanted to do something nice." They lapsed into a comfortable silence. Adrian watched her fold her hands, noticing the faint stress lines at the corners of her eyes. "Are you off work today?" he asked gently. She nodded. "I'm on a short break between shifts. I don't usually have a lot of free time, but my schedule is flexible enough that I can come by." He recognized her unspoken meaning. She wanted to be here, whatever uncertainties lingered between them. That realization made his chest tighten, a rush of warmth and awkward gratitude battling inside him. "I appreciate that," he said, swallowing the sudden lump in his throat. As they talked about trivial matters like the neon-painted walls of her shared apartment and the cat her roommate had just adopted, Adrian felt an unexpected longing for a mundane kind of connection. He had spent years surrounded by people with whom he conducted business, forging alliances and sealing multi-million-dollar deals. Yet he rarely spoke about the color of his walls or the simple comfort of a hot croissant. With Eliana, it felt startlingly natural to drift into these minor details of everyday life, even though a giant question hovered over them. How would they bridge 2 decades of absence? Late that evening, the doctor informed Adrian that he was well enough to leave the hospital in a few days, provided he arranged for ongoing care and rehab. He was relieved, yet also unsettled. Discharge meant stepping back into his fortress of a mansion, a place that now felt hollow. Lying awake in the dim glow of the corridor lights, he stared at the ceiling, replaying the conversations he and Eliana had shared. She had her own life, her own responsibilities. Did he have the right to ask her to visit once he returned home? Would she even want to? The day of his discharge arrived, and the hospital's administrative machinery swung into motion. A nurse wheeled in a cart of paperwork, while another handed him a plastic bag containing his medications. The physical therapist came to give him a final run-through of exercises. Adrian found himself overwhelmed by instructions, warnings about not overexerting, and follow-up appointment dates. In the midst of that flurry, Eliana slipped in, looking both official and personal in the same breath. She offered a smile that set his heart oddly at ease. "Ready to bust out of here?" she teased. Adrian gingerly stood, leaning on the walker they'd provided until he built enough strength. He tried to project his usual confidence, but the dull throb in his ribs reminded him he wasn't the unstoppable force he once imagined. "As ready as I'll ever be," he said, "though I'm not sure I'm prepared for everything waiting outside these walls." Eliana bit her lip, then glanced around as if uncertain whether to speak. Finally, she ventured, "If you need help, beyond the therapy visits, let me know. I can check on you after my shifts." It was a modest offer, but it resonated with him more than any corporate courtesy ever had. "I'd like that," he said, his voice warmer than he intended. They made their way to the hospital's exit together, stopping occasionally so Adrian could catch his breath and readjust his grip on the walker. The sky outside was a brilliant blue, and the swirl of fresh air felt almost shocking after so many days sealed indoors. A private driver stood waiting by a sleek black sedan, anxious to assist. Adrian looked back at Eliana, noticing how the sunlight caught the subtle bronze of her hair. He suddenly realized this was his last moment within the relative neutrality of the hospital. Once he left, there would be a world full of questions, responsibilities, and the ever-present knowledge that he had a daughter he barely knew. He cleared his throat. "Thank you for everything, not just the medical care, but for telling me the truth." Eliana's eyes held a tinge of emotion. "I'm glad I did. I was afraid of your reaction, but you've been surprisingly open." A strange laugh escaped Adrian. "Surprisingly? I'm sure you know I have a reputation for being controlling, difficult," she interjected, a faint teasing note in her voice. Adrian sighed, momentarily amused. "Among other things, yes, but I'm learning to adapt." Before he climbed into the car, he mustered the courage to ask, "Will I see you soon?" She pressed her lips together as if suppressing a deeper emotion. "Yes, I'm on shift tomorrow, but day after that, I'm free. I can come by and help you set up if you want." He nodded, fighting a grin that felt absurdly out of place for a man in his condition. "I'd like that." The journey home was uneventful, the car gliding through traffic while Adrian leaned back, eyes closed, absorbing the new reality of his body. The driver pulled through ornate gates into the circular driveway of Adrian's estate. Tall hedges and meticulously groomed landscaping framed the massive house. He hadn't realized how imposing it looked until he saw it through eyes tinged with vulnerability. Inside, the vaulted ceilings, gleaming floors, and modern sculptures stood as silent testaments to his ambition, but they also seemed eerily cold. A house built for entertaining lavishly, for hosting dignitaries, for projecting power. Not a home designed for the quiet presence of family. His housekeeper, an older woman named Marta, greeted him at the door with a flurry of concern. She assisted him to a bedroom on the ground floor, which she had already prepared to be more accessible while he healed. Adrian felt an odd pang. He hadn't even known she knew so much about his needs. He thanked her quietly, then lowered himself onto a plush bed that felt almost too soft after the firm hospital mattress. Alone at last, he gazed at the swirling patterns on the ceiling, trying to quell the swirl of emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. He pictured Eliana stepping through the grand foyer, perhaps making a wry comment about how the place resembled a museum more than a residence. Would she feel out of place here? Would she see it as proof that he'd chosen wealth over a chance at human connection? The thought unsettled him, but he also recognized a flicker of hope. For all its grandeur, this mansion now had room for something more meaningful than another set of corporate trophies. Maybe it could, in time, become a space of real warmth. That night, he wandered through silent hallways, using a cane the physical therapist had recommended as a step down from the walker. His feet made soft echoes on the marble floors. In a darkened lounge, city lights sparkled through floor-to-ceiling windows. He sank onto a leather couch, letting the view wash over him. For years, success had been his only measure of worth. Now he found himself wondering if success meant anything at all without someone to share it with, without some deeper sense of belonging. He thought of Eliana, her courage in telling him the truth, her steady hands as she performed her duties, her quiet sadness over a lost mother. He thought of Carmen, how she had once twirled around his kitchen to a jazz record, laughing when he insisted the volume was too loud. A dull ache throbbed beneath his bandages. He couldn't change the past, but maybe he could finally learn what it meant to build a real bond with another person. Maybe, in the uncertain days ahead, father and daughter could find a way to bridge the gap of lost years. Early the next morning, Adrian woke to a pale light filtering through the windows of his downstairs bedroom, the subdued hush of the house surrounding him. He no longer had the constant clamor of the hospital, a blessing in some ways, yet oddly disquieting. The lavish silence of his mansion felt lonelier than the busy corridors of recovery. He pushed aside the blankets and eased himself upright, every movement a reminder that he still carried the bruises and fractures from the accident. Each day his body mended a little further, but he knew that emotional healing might prove more complicated. Marta, the housekeeper, appeared at his door after a light knock. She carried a breakfast tray with toast, fruit, and a small pot of coffee. "Good morning, Mr. Blackwood," she said softly, setting the tray on a bedside table. "I've added extra pillows to your chair in the study if you'd like to spend time there later. It'll be more comfortable than staying in bed all day." Adrian gave her a grateful nod. He had never been especially close to Marta, but the kindness in her gestures took on new significance now that he had experienced how fragile life could be. "Thank you," he murmured. "I appreciate it." He spent the morning occupying himself with shallow attempts at productivity, opening his laptop to read the latest updates from his executives. Reports and forecasts flickered across the screen, a ceaseless flow of figures that once would have enthralled him. But now, despite his best efforts to focus, his mind wandered to Eliana. He replayed their recent talks in the hospital, her stories about Carmen, and the shy warmth in her eyes whenever he acknowledged her place in his life. A part of him still grappled with disbelief. How could he have passed so many years without the faintest inkling that he had a daughter? In the early afternoon, he managed to walk slowly from his bedroom to the study, leaning on the cane that replaced the hospital walker. The journey of just a few rooms left him winded, a stark reminder of how much strength he had lost. Settling into the chair Marta had prepared, he found himself taking in the study's imposing shelves of leather-bound books, the cold marble fireplace, the grand mahogany desk. He had once believed these trappings projected success, a testament to his discipline and achievement. Now they felt like relics of a previous life, artifacts that failed to acknowledge the simpler, more human needs he was only beginning to recognize in himself. He was startled from his reverie by the chime of the doorbell. Voices echoed briefly through the foyer before the heavy front door closed. Moments later, Eliana appeared at the study's threshold, clutching a tote bag slung over her shoulder. She wore jeans and a comfortable sweater, her hair loosely pulled back. Though her expression was outwardly calm, he spotted a hint of uncertainty in the way she hovered near the doorframe. "Hi," she said, giving a small wave. "Marta let me in. I hope this isn't a bad time." Adrian realized his heart felt strangely light at the sight of her. "Not at all," he replied, motioning for her to enter. "I was just thinking about you." A faint blush colored her cheeks. "Oh?" she murmured, stepping farther inside. She glanced around, taking in the tall bookshelves and the large windows overlooking the meticulously landscaped garden. "This house is incredible," she said softly, though there was no clear admiration in her tone. It seemed she found it more overwhelming than appealing. He nodded, shifting in his seat to ease the pressure on his ribs. "It's a bit much when you're just one person," he admitted. "I guess I never thought about whether I'd share it." She gave a timid smile and set her tote bag on a nearby table. "I brought some things," she explained. "Bandages, antiseptic wipes. I wasn't sure if you had enough medical supplies. I also picked up a few groceries. I figured something simple might help you cook, or at least get by without ordering takeout every meal." Adrian blinked, surprised by her thoughtfulness. "That's very considerate," he managed, feeling a warmth spread through him that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. Moving closer, she inspected his posture. "Are you in pain?" she asked quietly. He shrugged with one shoulder, trying to be dismissive. "Not too bad, mostly stiff. The doctor said walking more each day will help, but I'm still wiped out after a few minutes." She nodded, her gaze drifting to the cane leaning against the chair. "Well, I can help with small chores if you want, or I can leave you alone. I don't want to invade your space." He heard the unspoken question. Did he truly want her around, or was he simply being polite? For a moment, Adrian's pride wrestled with his desire to accept her presence. He had spent a lifetime projecting an image of capability, never revealing when he felt uncertain or weak. Yet something in Eliana's gentle offer broke down his usual defenses. "I'd be glad for the company," he admitted, gesturing toward a smaller armchair near his own. "Besides, you might as well see this place. It's too big for me to show you all at once, but maybe you can help me figure out which rooms need improving." Eliana's eyes flickered with understanding. "I'd be happy to," she said softly. She took a seat, her posture relaxed, though he sensed a quiet tension beneath it. She seemed to scan the rows of books, her attention occasionally catching on a framed set of business awards. "It's interesting," she remarked after a moment. "I always read about you in magazines or saw your face on financial news segments, but none of that really prepared me to see you here, in your own space, just being a person." The comment struck Adrian with surprising force. He realized that for years he'd curated a public persona, the tireless magnate, always in control. There was little room in that narrative for mistakes or hidden vulnerabilities. Now his daughter, his very real flesh and blood daughter, was witnessing him at his weakest, broken from an accident and barely able to climb a flight of stairs. Oddly enough, it felt liberating to let her see that side. "I suppose I've always hidden behind that image," he confessed. "Sometimes I even believed it myself." Eliana's gaze was gentle. "People do what they have to, right?" she said. "My mom used to say that in life everyone learns how to be strong in some way. Yours was building an empire and hers was raising me alone. But deep down, we're all just trying to make the best of what we've got." Her words tugged at the knot of regret in his chest. He remembered Carmen's laughter, the subtle pain in her eyes when he told her he needed to fly overseas for a sudden business deal. He should have paid better attention. He should have asked more questions. Now, the only link he had left to that chapter of his life was sitting in front of him, fiddling with the edge of her sweater. Silence stretched between them before Adrian cleared his throat. "I'd like to show you something." He reached over to a small side table where he'd placed a photograph he had recently dug out of an old storage box. It was a picture of Carmen. She stood in a sunlit garden, arms folded across her chest, smiling in a way that suggested she was about to burst into laughter. She looked vibrant, free, alive. He handed the photograph to Eliana, who took it with reverent care. "This was my favorite picture of her," he said. "I found it buried in a stack of paperwork this morning." Eliana inhaled sharply. "Oh," she whispered, brushing a fingertip across the image. "She's so young." Adrian nodded. "I took this after she roped me into a rare weekend off. We visited a place outside the city with flower fields and a little orchard. She said she wanted to see me away from deadlines, to catch me in the moment. It was a good day." He watched Eliana's face tighten with emotion. "I never saw this photo," she murmured. "She must have kept it somewhere safe. I'm glad you have it now." They sat for a long time, leaning into the shared remembrance of a woman who had shaped them both. Adrian felt an ache behind his eyes, the tears he rarely allowed himself. To think that this moment, father and daughter connecting through memories of Carmen, could only happen after tragedy and countless lost years. Yet it felt like a fragile gift, one he had no intention of wasting. "Eliana," he said finally, voice trembling just enough to reveal the depth of his sincerity. "I know we can't rewrite the past, but I want you to know that I'm here, whatever that looks like, however this unfolds." She glanced up, tears glistening. "Thank you," she said, a waver in her voice. "I'm here too." In that quiet admission, Adrian sensed a measure of forgiveness and a promise for the future. They had miles to go before trust replaced caution, but at least they had begun. By the time Eliana stood to leave, the sun was dipping below the garden walls, casting an amber glow through the study windows. He walked her to the door, each step reinforcing that he still had limits. Yet when he paused to unlock the elaborate security system, he realized how symbolic this moment was. He was letting her out into the night with the understanding she would return. She gave him a small wave and slipped outside, leaving him with the soft hush of the house once again. He lingered by the doorway, the cane in his hand, his breath slightly ragged from the exertion. A sense of possibility pulsed through him. The house no longer felt so impossibly large. It was still an echo chamber of wealth and ambition, but now it harbored memories of Eliana's footsteps. He could almost picture her moving through the rooms, turning them into something more than displays of status. For the first time in years, Adrian felt a spark of hope about truly letting someone in. Tomorrow, and the day after, and all the days that followed would test whether he could nurture that spark into something real. Over the next few days, Adrian found himself adjusting to a peculiar new routine. Morning painkillers, slow walks around the property, sporadic check-ins with business associates, and occasional visits from Eliana. Though she couldn't come by every day, her presence lingered in subtle changes around the house. He would notice that the kitchen pantry had a fresh carton of milk or that a healthy meal was left in a neatly labeled container for him to reheat. Each small gesture made him realize how lonely he had allowed his world to become. He began to wonder what it might look like to make his mansion into more than just a monument to success. The medical staff who arrived to check his bandages or administer therapy would remark on his progress, but no one asked about the personal transformations that were slowly unfolding. Adrian himself scarcely had the vocabulary to explain them. Late one morning, as sunlight slanted through the high windows, Adrian was in the study wrestling with corporate emails. His CFO had flagged urgent concerns about a dip in the company's stock price following news of his accident, and the board of directors requested his immediate input on how to reassure investors. Scrolling through the anxious messages, he felt a flicker of his old self, an adrenaline surge that once spurred him to tackle challenges head-on. But his healing body and the emotional weight of recent revelations tempered any illusions of invincibility. At last, he put down his phone, took a controlled breath, and reached for the documents piled on the desk. He would address these matters thoughtfully, but not at the expense of his fragile recovery. The crash had taught him that driving himself to extremes was no longer an option he could afford. That afternoon, he stepped outside with careful deliberation, letting the crisp breeze wash over his face. He was determined to move beyond the sterile confines of the study, so he ventured onto a stone path winding through the gardens. Though the cane felt clumsy in his hand, he savored the sense of freedom that came from simply breathing in fresh air and feeling sunlight on his skin. Marta had discreetly arranged for a bench halfway along the path, and Adrian sat down there, gazing at a row of manicured hedges swaying gently in the breeze. He noticed for the first time how intricately the gardener had trimmed them, each leaf shaped as if part of a grand design. A pang of regret accompanied this realization. For years he had paid staff to maintain grounds he rarely set foot upon, choosing instead to remain sealed away in his office. While he was still absorbing the tranquility of the garden, the gate buzzer sounded in the distance. A short while later, Eliana appeared, guided through the property by Marta. She wore a casual jacket and had her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. In her arms was a neatly folded blanket. Adrian raised an eyebrow questioningly as she approached. She smiled, explaining that she had planned a small outdoor picnic, provided he was up to it. Amused and touched by her thoughtful idea, he nodded. After she spread out the blanket beside the bench, he lowered himself carefully, leaning on his cane. The afternoon sun cast a warm glow across the green lawn. Eliana opened a small bag of snacks, crackers, cheese, some cut fruit, and offered him a plastic cup of lemonade. The moment felt surreal. Him, the reclusive tycoon, sharing a casual picnic in his own garden with the daughter he never knew he had. They chatted quietly at first, the hush of the garden providing an unexpected sense of intimacy. Eliana asked about his day-to-day struggles with pain, while Adrian inquired about her nursing shifts and the classes she planned to take for continued certification. The conversation flowed, gentle and unforced, though both seemed aware of the deeper questions that still loomed. Eventually, Eliana ventured into more personal territory. "I've been thinking about Mom a lot," she admitted, eyes drifting to a swirl of petals on the grass. "She would have been amazed to see us here. She always hoped you'd meet me someday." Her voice caught slightly, and Adrian felt his throat tighten. He reached for her hand, aware of how foreign the gesture felt, yet the look of gratitude in her eyes told him it was right. They sat like that a moment, letting the soft breeze speak what neither knew how to articulate. At last, Adrian murmured, "I wish I had known earlier. Everything might have been different." Eliana gave a small nod, her gaze dropping to where his hand rested over hers. "We can't change the past," she said gently, "but we can decide how to move forward. Mom taught me that life is made of second chances, even if they come in unexpected ways." Her words resonated with him, aligning with the sense of possibility he'd begun to nurture since the accident. The quiet between them was charged, not with regret alone, but with a cautious hope. When they finally rose to pack up the picnic, Adrian braced himself on his cane, grateful for the chance to stand beside his daughter. They made their way back to the house, stepping through the wide doors into a space that felt a little less daunting with each passing day. Inside, Eliana helped him navigate a short flight of steps leading to the study. He lowered himself into a comfortable chair, feeling both tired and oddly fulfilled. "Do you need anything?" she asked, fussing with the folded blanket they had brought in. Adrian shook his head. "You've done enough," he said, though his tone carried an appreciation he rarely showed. She smiled, setting the blanket aside. The hum of the house enveloped them, a quiet that once would have reinforced Adrian's sense of isolation, but now felt unexpectedly companionable. After a pause, Eliana cleared her throat. "I'd better head out soon. I have an overnight shift." He nodded, a twinge of disappointment lodging in his chest. "Of course. Thank you for today." As she left, Adrian realized how much he had come to value her presence. The emptiness that returned once she was gone was a reminder of the life he still hoped to rebuild. That evening, after the last of the staff had retreated to their quarters, Adrian ventured through the house with methodical purpose. He paused to inspect rooms he barely remembered, an empty, formal dining area, a grand piano room blanketed in dust, and a rarely used sitting parlor. Each space told a story of extravagance, yet none spoke of warmth or belonging. Eventually, he returned to the study and retrieved the floral-patterned notebook Eliana had shown him. He flipped through Carmen's scribbled verses, imagining the life she had lived after leaving him behind. With a careful hand, he pressed a loose photograph into the pages, a snapshot from earlier that day, taken by Eliana on her phone and printed out at a nearby pharmacy. In it, he and his daughter sat on the garden blanket, smiling uncertainly at the camera. A new piece of history, fragile and precious, had begun to form. Adrian closed the notebook, resolving that from now on, he would not let it gather dust. In the quiet hush of the late hour, he sat by the dim glow of a single lamp, reflecting on how his life had shifted. A week ago, this house was a showcase of wealth. Now, it held a new pulse, one that matched his steps toward fatherhood. He realized his accident might have been a blessing, a halt that forced him to see what he'd missed. With Eliana's help, perhaps he could craft a different legacy, one bound not by power, but by genuine human connection. In the days that followed, Adrian discovered that progress came in subtle, uneven steps. His body grew stronger with each methodical round of physical therapy, but he still felt clumsy navigating the halls of his own mansion. Early in the morning, he would leave his downstairs bedroom and make slow circuits past the arched windows, pausing whenever the ache in his ribs demanded it. The mild autumn light filtered in, revealing a home he once viewed as an extension of his ambition. Now it seemed strangely hollow, without the human connections he'd so often neglected. Eliana's visits continued, though her schedule allowed only short bursts of time between her hospital shifts. Some days, she would bring him fresh groceries or a meal she'd cooked at her apartment. On others, she arrived simply to sit with him in the study, quietly reading or chatting about her daily life. They spoke in cautious increments about the vast gap between them, 2 decades during which he had risen to the zenith of corporate success, and she had struggled through nights of part-time jobs and second-hand textbooks. Each revelation felt like a missing piece slotting into place, but neither father nor daughter dared to rush into long, soul-bearing confessions. Their bond was still too new, held together by equal parts hope and uncertainty. One afternoon, while Eliana was at work, Adrian attempted a more ambitious walk around the property. With his cane in hand and determination in his stride, he followed the garden paths all the way to a winding trail that dipped behind a row of tall hedges. The scenery beyond was surprisingly lovely, a small pond, a cluster of willow trees, and a wooden bench that faced a quiet stretch of water. He couldn't recall ever taking the time to stroll here. Years ago, he had approved landscaping plans for the estate without thinking he might one day need a tranquil space to reflect. Gingerly, he lowered himself onto the bench. The scent of moss and damp earth enveloped him. He took in a deep breath, letting the rustle of leaves offer a sort of solace. In that stillness, his phone buzzed, a sharp intrusion. A glance at the screen revealed a message from his CFO, informing him that the board had convened an urgent meeting to address the continuing slump in stock prices. Already, rumors circulated about Adrian's capacity to lead. Some whispered that perhaps he wouldn't recover quickly enough, and that the company needed a steadier hand at the helm. Reading those words, Adrian felt his pulse spike. He remembered a time when this would have galvanized him. He would have leapt into action, determined to show everyone he was indispensable. Now, a different wave washed over him, an odd mixture of fatigue and newfound clarity. A part of him acknowledged the gravity of the situation. His empire was built on investor confidence, and if the board doubted his abilities, they could maneuver against him. But a more profound part of him refused to give in to panic. The accident had peeled away so many illusions. He recognized that maybe he had indeed built a structure too dependent on his perpetual motion, too fragile to survive his absence. It stung his pride, yet it also emboldened him to consider a gentler approach. Carefully, he typed out a response. "I understand the concerns. Set up a virtual meeting for tomorrow. I will address everyone." Then he exhaled, placing the phone aside. For just a moment longer, he allowed himself to remain in the hush of the garden. He returned indoors later, worn from the walk. Marta discreetly helped him remove his coat, her eyes full of unspoken worry at how unsteady he appeared. Adrian forced a small smile, assuring her that he was fine, just tired. After she left, he sank onto a velvet-cushioned bench in the foyer, thinking how even small tasks like climbing the wide staircase felt monumental now. Still, he pressed on, heading to the study with measured footsteps. Once there, he immersed himself in preparation for the next day's video conference, scanning financial statements, reviewing proposed strategies. But beneath the swirl of data, his thoughts kept returning to Eliana. He realized that for the first time in his life he was torn between ambition and the desire for something more real. He wanted his company to thrive, but he also wanted to nurture a bond that had lain dormant for far too long. That evening, a knock on the front door sounded well past sunset. Expecting no one, Adrian rose with difficulty and made his way to greet the visitor. Much to his surprise, it was Eliana, looking fatigued yet determined. "I just finished a double shift," she explained, stepping inside. "I know it's late, but I needed to see how you're doing. Is that okay?" Adrian blinked, touched by her concern. "Of course," he said quietly, welcoming her into the grand foyer. She slipped off her light jacket, revealing scrubs beneath. The lines of strain on her face were clear. No doubt she had spent hours on her feet, tending to patients. He offered her a seat in the small sitting room adjacent to the foyer, and she sank onto the plush chair with a sigh of relief. "Rough day?" he asked gently, lowering himself onto another seat. She nodded. "A patient coded on my shift, and we couldn't bring him back. He was only in his 50s. Her voice trembled slightly. "Sometimes, no matter how hard you try, people slip away." Adrian felt a pang of empathy. He had spent much of his life fixated on numbers and performance metrics, but the notion of truly battling life and death situations was foreign to him. "I'm sorry," he said. "That must be difficult." Eliana took a moment before responding. "It's part of the job," she admitted, "but it doesn't get easier. I guess it reminded me how fast things can change." Her gaze met his, a hint of vulnerability shining through. "Made me think of your accident, and how close I came to never having the chance to tell you the truth." The weight of her words settled between them. Adrian leaned forward, resting on the cane he still carried for balance. "I'm grateful you told me, Eliana. Whatever happens next, business crises, board meetings, none of it feels as important as making sure I don't waste this second chance." She studied him for a moment, as if measuring his sincerity. Then she relaxed a fraction, offering a tired smile. "You sound so different from the man I saw on TV all those years," she said. "He always seemed untouchable." Adrian let out a faint chuckle. "That man was an illusion I cultivated, I suppose. But illusions shatter when real life intervenes. I've learned the hard way that you can't outrun mortality or the relationships that come knocking when you least expect them." A silence followed, not heavy with discomfort but with mutual understanding. At length Eliana yawned, looking sheepish. "I'm sorry, I'm just exhausted." Adrian waved off her apology. "No, you should rest. Marta keeps a guest room on the ground floor ready for unexpected visitors. Stay if you want, it's late and you need sleep." She hesitated, glancing toward the door. "I don't want to impose." "You're not imposing," he interjected gently. "You're my daughter." The simple statement lingered in the air as if both of them were still getting used to hearing it. Finally, she nodded, acquiescing with a small smile. "All right, thank you." He directed her to the guest room, which was modest by the mansion's standards, just a private bath, a queen-sized bed, and soft lighting. She murmured gratitude, disappearing behind the door. Standing alone in the hallway, Adrian realized his heart felt unexpectedly full. Yes, the board might be ready to circle like vultures at the slightest sign of weakness, but that thought no longer paralyzed him with dread. There were more important facets to his life now. The following morning, Adrian prepared for the virtual board meeting. He had asked Eliana if she wanted to sit in, just to see a glimpse of what he dealt with daily. She'd been amused but politely declined, stating she needed to step out for a while to run errands. By the time the meeting started, he was alone in the study, propping the tablet on a stand so he could appear upright without straining his ribs. One by one, the board members' faces appeared on the screen, their greetings laced with polite concern. Some seemed genuinely relieved to see him, others stony-faced with skepticism. Adrian cleared his throat. "Thank you all for joining," he began. "I'm recovering steadily, and I have every intention of resuming my leadership. However, I also recognize that my accident highlighted a vulnerability in our structure." He paused, letting the words sink in. A few eyebrows lifted in surprise. Adrian pressed on. "I have absolute faith in our team, and I'm going to delegate more responsibilities to senior executives. We're pivoting into an era where we must be flexible. My health is returning, but my perspective has changed. We can't base the entire corporation on one person's relentless drive." The call buzzed with the static of unspoken astonishment. In the past, Adrian would have fought tooth and nail to maintain total control. Now he found himself acknowledging limits. A barrage of questions followed about profit forecasts, strategic shifts, and the potential for an interim CEO. Adrian answered calmly, emphasizing continuity rather than power. By the meeting's end, the tense lines on some board members' faces had eased. Adrian sensed they were cautiously willing to accept that he wasn't abdicating, but neither was he imposing the rigid hierarchy that once defined his reign. When he finally disconnected, his body sagged in fatigue. The stress had worn him down, yet he felt lighter. It was a small victory, one that might pave the way for a more balanced approach in his life. Later that afternoon, Eliana returned and Adrian rose slowly to greet her at the entrance. She carried a paper bag full of groceries and looked at him questioningly. "How did the meeting go?" He offered a faint grin. "Better than I expected. I told them things would have to change." She set down the groceries, studying him carefully. "And how do you feel about that?" He considered her question. "I feel ready," he answered. "For once, I'm not fighting to hold on to everything so tightly." His voice wavered slightly with emotion, but he allowed it. He had nothing left to hide. That evening, after the intense board meeting and a long afternoon of reviewing numbers, Adrian found himself on the back patio, gazing out at the sprawling gardens illuminated by soft, low-voltage lights. He leaned on his cane, shifting his weight with care to avoid jolting his healing ribs. Night air rolled in, cool and fragrant, a gentle reminder that autumn had nearly run its course. His mind drifted to the changes he had just set in motion within his company. For years he'd ruled with an iron grip, believing that any sign of leniency would undermine his authority. Now, in the quiet hush of moonlight, he felt both relief and the faint stirrings of fear. He had opened the door to a more collaborative leadership style, but only time would tell if the board truly embraced his vision, or if, under the guise of unity, they would find a way to edge him out. His thoughts shifted to Eliana. She had retired early for the night in the guest room down the hall from his own, exhausted from her back-to-back shifts. He still couldn't fully grasp how swiftly she had become part of his daily routine. It was as if her presence filled corners of the mansion he never realized were empty. He remembered the compassion in her eyes when she spoke about her patients, the determined way she carried groceries and medical supplies, the quiet steadiness she offered when he wobbled on his cane. He had always assumed fatherhood was out of reach, a sacrifice he'd chosen to make in exchange for his career. Yet here she was, no longer a child, but a grown woman forging her own path. He remained on the patio for nearly half an hour, letting the stars above keep him silent company. When at last he felt a twinge of chill in his aching limbs, he made his way inside. The cool marble floors reflected the subdued light of recessed fixtures, and every step felt like another small test of endurance. He paused in the foyer, glancing at the wide staircase. On an impulse, he decided to climb it, an attempt to measure how much progress he had made since returning home. He tightened his grip on the banister, taking the steps one at a time. Each lift of his leg reminded him of the bruising, but he pressed forward, determined not to be a prisoner on the ground floor forever. He reached the landing with a triumphant exhale, although sweat beaded on his forehead. The corridor stretched before him, a line of closed doors leading to guest rooms rarely used. Far at the end was the master suite he had abandoned after the accident, too stubborn and weak to climb the stairs. Inching along, he made his way to the tall double doors that stood like silent sentinels. When he pushed them open, the darkness within greeted him as if no time had passed since he last slept there. A king-size bed, draped in pristine linens, dominated the center, flanked by imposing pieces of antique furniture that felt suddenly pretentious. He flicked on a lamp, its golden light revealing faint motes of dust dancing in the air. He wondered what Eliana would think of this room. Did it seem like just another exhibit in his personal museum? He imagined her teasing him gently about the size of the wardrobe, or perhaps pointing out the number of suits he owned but never wore more than once. With a subtle grimace, he realized how disconnected he had become from the simplest human experiences. Maybe, he mused, it was time for the master suite to lose some of its formal sterility. He didn't linger, aware that overexertion could send him stumbling back down the stairs. After a brief examination of the silent space, he turned, retracing his steps toward the landing. Descending took just as long, but he managed without mishap, silently proud of his progress. By the time he returned to the guest wing on the ground floor, a deep fatigue had settled into his bones. He eased into bed, letting the cane rest against the nightstand. Before closing his eyes, he allowed one last thought to surface, that perhaps tomorrow he would show Eliana the upper floors and let her see the full scope of his domain. He wanted her to know he was done hiding behind locked doors and lonely corridors. The next morning, he woke to the soft sound of clinking porcelain. Sunlight streamed through partially drawn curtains, revealing Eliana standing by a small table where she'd set up a simple breakfast. oatmeal, fruit, and tea. She turned when she sensed him stir, and the morning light caught the faint circle of shadows under her eyes. "I thought you might like something healthy," she said, "and I didn't want to wake you too early." Adrian blinked away sleep, rubbing his face. "You're up early yourself, considering how late you got in," he commented, swinging his legs to the edge of the bed. The floor felt cool under his bare feet. She shrugged. "Guess I'm used to odd hours. The hospital schedule isn't exactly forgiving." He nodded, knowing that in her profession, rest was a luxury, not a guarantee. "Thank you for this," he added, gesturing at the modest spread. "It's been a while since someone prepared me breakfast without me expecting it as a paid service." She handed him a bowl of oatmeal, steam curling in the air. He noticed the slight tremor in her hands, likely from residual fatigue. He accepted it with care, stirring in a bit of honey. They ate together in a companionable silence, each acclimating to the morning. After a few spoonfuls, Eliana set down her bowl, cleared her throat, and asked, "Are you feeling up to a walk today? I'd like to see more of the house." He offered her a small smile. "I was thinking the same thing last night. I made a trip upstairs, first time since the hospital." Her eyebrows rose. "You climbed the stairs on your own?" A note of concern threaded her voice. "Was that safe?" Adrian gave a casual shrug, though he couldn't hide his slight pride. "I managed, but I'm sure it'd be better with you around. Care to join me now?" A short while later, they embarked on a slow exploration of the mansion. Adrian pointed out rooms that once served as showpieces for parties he barely enjoyed hosting. They passed by a sleek home theater, its screen bigger than most living rooms, which he admitted he rarely used. Eliana brushed her fingertips over the rows of plush seats with a curious smile, and he felt a pang of guilt. He could have used such a space to spend time with someone, but he never had. Ascending the stairs together, he paused frequently, grateful for her steady arm to lean on. When they reached the master suite, she walked inside, glancing around at the massive bed and mirrored dressers. It was the first time he felt self-conscious about the place, worried she might see it as a monument to ego. "It's big," she said, her voice echoing slightly in the cavernous space, "but I guess you have every right to indulge after working so hard." Her tone was neutral, free of judgment, but Adrian felt compelled to respond. "I used to think so," he admitted. "Now I'm not so sure. There's a fine line between rewarding yourself and isolating yourself." She studied him, then gave a nod that suggested she understood more than she let on. They continued the tour, crossing into the adjacent wing of guest suites, each more elaborately decorated than the last. Eliana's soft exhalations of wonder or amusement punctuated the silence. Eventually, they settled in a smaller lounge near the back of the house, where tall windows overlooked a second-story balcony. Rays of light illuminated dust motes in the air, and Adrian lowered himself carefully onto a sofa, motioning for Eliana to join him. "Thank you," she said after a moment, gazing out at the view of the gardens below, "for sharing all this with me." Adrian traced the carved wooden arm of the sofa, the swirl of the pattern reminding him how much detail he'd overlooked in his quest for bigger, better everything. "You're my daughter," he replied simply. "You deserve to see it." Her expression flickered with an emotion he couldn't quite define. Gratitude, sadness, perhaps a mixture. "Sometimes I feel like I've stepped into another world," she admitted quietly. "I still remember the tiny apartment where I grew up. We'd struggled to pay the rent, and the idea of living in a house like this was beyond imagining. Yet here you are, giving me a personal tour." He wanted to apologize again, but something told him words of regret were becoming redundant. Instead, he reached out, briefly touching her hand. "I can't change the past," he said, voice subdued. "But maybe we can create a future that isn't so divided." They lapsed into silence, sharing the hush of the lounge. Below them, the gardener moved through the lawns, trimming hedges and tending flower beds. Adrian recognized for the first time that he had allowed life to happen on his behalf, content to remain behind the scenes focused on profits and expansions. Now that detachment felt less like comfort and more like lost time. At length, Eliana rose. "I should head to work," she said, smoothing her sweater. "But before I go, I wanted to ask, you mentioned your board meeting went well. Are you truly okay with stepping back a bit? I don't want you to regret any decisions you've made on my account." He considered her question. "It wasn't just for you," he answered, pushing himself carefully to his feet. "It was for me too. I realized I can't keep running full throttle forever, and I don't want to. There's more to life than boardrooms." A small, relieved smile brightened her face. "I'm glad to hear that," she said, heading toward the staircase. "I'll see you soon, okay?" He watched her descend, the gentle thud of her steps echoing against the walls. In that moment, he felt a mix of tenderness and regret. Tenderness for the bond they were forging, and regret for the years they had lost. Yet he also felt the faint stirrings of pride. This was his daughter, a woman of resilience and compassion. Perhaps after so much time spent immersed in the pursuit of success, this was the greatest gift fate could have offered him, a chance at real human connection, if he had the courage to nurture it. Adrian spent the following week caught between two parallel worlds. One was the high-stakes corporate sphere, where his board members and top executives continued to demand updates, propose new strategies, and fret over the company's public image. The other was the quieter realm of his home, where Eliana's presence infused each day with moments of warmth and reflection. He no longer felt compelled to sacrifice one world for the other. A tentative balance seemed possible, provided he navigated each step with care. He gradually transitioned from the cane to a sturdy walking stick, grateful that his ribs had healed enough to let him move with a semblance of confidence. Physical therapy sessions became less about simple survival and more about reclaiming parts of his life, climbing stairs without wincing, standing for longer stretches without feeling his legs start to tremble. Each small victory reassured him that his body was capable of bouncing back, even if he would never again take his agility for granted. Late one afternoon, as a crisp breeze rustled the final golden leaves from the trees, Eliana brought a laptop over to the lounge near the back balcony. "I set up a teleconference with my college advisor," she explained, settling onto a love seat across from Adrian. "I'm thinking of enrolling in some advanced courses next semester, if I can fit them around my shifts. Would you mind if I did the call here? My apartment's Wi-Fi is acting up." He shook his head, smiling. "Of course not. Make yourself at home." He was struck by how easily she had begun to occupy his space, as though the walls no longer loomed with silent judgment but welcomed her quietly, acknowledging she had every right to be here. While Eliana waited for her advisor to connect, Adrian returned to reviewing a new batch of proposals from his CFO. Every so often, he lifted his gaze to watch her concentrate on the screen. The seriousness in her eyes reminded him that this was a young woman shaping her own destiny, forging a career of compassion and service. He felt an unexpected twinge of pride. When her advisor finally appeared, Eliana spoke in hushed professional tones, discussing class schedules, internship credits, and clinical rotations. Adrian tried not to eavesdrop, yet he couldn't help catching snatches of her determined plan to specialize in critical care, maybe even become a nurse practitioner someday. Hearing her ambition made him reflect on his own relentless climb. He wondered if he had once sounded that impassioned, that single-minded. Yet there was a difference in Eliana's voice, a warmth that suggested her goals were rooted in empathy, not mere conquest. Her call ended with polite goodbyes, and she shut the laptop, a slight crease on her brow. "Well," she murmured, "it'll be challenging, but I'm going to try. I don't want to let the chance slip away. Mom always told me there's no shame in dreaming big if you're willing to do the work." Adrian nodded, meeting her gaze. She was right. "And if there's anything you need, financially, resource-wise, please don't hesitate to ask. I know you value your independence, but I'm here to support you." She hesitated, fingers brushing the laptop's cover. "I'm not used to that kind of offer," she admitted softly. "We always scraped by, did everything ourselves, but maybe I'd accept help if it's not about me relying on someone to rescue me, but about working together. Does that make sense?" Adrian's chest tightened with a mix of admiration and guilt. "It does, and I'm glad you see it that way." They talked for a while longer about her plans, delving into the logistics of balancing classes and the demands of hospital shifts. Adrian kept his suggestions practical. He had once believed success meant forging ahead alone, but now he saw the power of collaboration, even if it was just father and daughter brainstorming ways to make her schedule more manageable. That evening, after Eliana left for her next shift, Adrian found himself pacing the foyer, phone in hand, ignoring the residual ache in his ribs. A restlessness pounded through him, a sense that although his life had improved immeasurably since discovering Eliana, some looming challenge still awaited. His board had been cooperative so far, but he sensed hidden turbulence in the corporate waters. A part of him dreaded the possibility that once he fully recovered, the board might have grown comfortable operating without him. They could argue that a newly enlightened Adrian, more focused on personal matters, was no longer suitable for total leadership. He knew the corporate game well enough to anticipate such maneuvers. Before going to bed, he fired off a message to his top executives requesting a private meeting in 2 days, a chance to solidify a plan that would reassure investors and maintain a healthy level of collaboration. He refused to return to the old dynamic of obsessive control, but neither did he intend to vanish into the background. It would require finesse, a balance of trust and authority that he was only just learning to strike. Early the next morning, he climbed back upstairs and stepped into the master suite for the first time since his solitary excursion. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the minimalist decor. Rich fabrics, sleek lines, immaculate surfaces with no trace of personal clutter. It struck him that the room revealed nothing of its owner's heart. If Eliana walked in right now, she'd find no evidence that it belonged to a real person, let alone a father. He imagined photos on the bedside table, maybe a painting or keepsake that signified cherished memories. But everything was sanitized as though his life had been curated for display. Taking a slow breath, he resolved to change that. In a small chest, he stashed away certain items that had long gathered dust in hidden corners of the house. Old photographs of Carmen, a few letters from early business mentors, even a childhood memento, a tattered baseball glove once given to him by an uncle. He spread them out on the bed, sorting through these fragments of a past he had compartmentalized for far too long. As he picked up Carmen's photograph, the same one he had once shown Eliana, he couldn't help murmuring, "I hope you'd be proud of her. She's strong, kinder than I ever was, and she has your spirit." An unexpected pang of grief sliced through him. He wished he could share these reflections with Carmen, could apologize for being so consumed by ambition that he hadn't realized what he was losing. But regrets were no longer solely burdens. They had become catalysts, fueling his desire to do better by Eliana. He decided then and there to place that photo on the nightstand. It felt right, a small but significant nod to the family he had almost missed. Back downstairs, he spent the rest of the day conferring with a private interior designer, someone he'd hired sporadically for renovations. This time, he asked her to help transform one of the upstairs bedrooms into a comfortable space should Eliana ever choose to stay longer. He insisted it not be extravagant, just welcoming, a place she could call her own when she visited. The designer smiled at his unusual request, promising to keep it modest yet warm. Adrian sensed he was building something tangible, even if it took time for Eliana to accept the gesture. Late that afternoon, he received a text from Eliana between her patient rounds, heading home soon, feeling drained. Might not make it tonight. He typed back, "That's okay. Take care of yourself. I'll be here." A simple reassurance, but it reflected how much he'd shifted from the man who once demanded constant attention on his timetable. Now, he valued her well-being over any personal desire to see her. The transformation felt like a triumph in its own small way. That night, as he settled into bed, his gaze fell on the photo of Carmen. For a moment, he considered how strange it was to be talking out loud to a memory. "Still," he whispered, "I'm trying, you know. It's not perfect, but I'm giving this my best shot." The quiet in the room seemed to absorb his words, offering neither judgment nor solace. Yet he felt more at peace than he had in a long time. The following day came with an undercurrent of apprehension, his scheduled private meeting with the key executives. He set up a conference call from the study, ensuring the camera angle didn't reveal how carefully he still adjusted himself in his seat to avoid pain. The participants joined one by one, each greeting him with polite deference. Once everyone had arrived, Adrian laid out his vision, a balance of power among senior management, with room for new voices and a strategic pivot toward more sustainable, socially conscious projects. It was a bold move for a company known primarily for cutthroat growth strategies, but he believed it was time they reflected a broader responsibility. Reactions were mixed. A few executives expressed cautious enthusiasm, sensing the opportunity to differentiate the company from its competitors. Others were more reserved, worried about losing the aggressive edge that had defined them. Adrian listened more than he spoke, a stark contrast to his old style, and invited dialogue. Though the meeting was tense at times, they reached a collective decision to pilot some smaller-scale projects, aligned with Adrian's new perspective. By the end, the tension had eased into a feeling of guarded optimism. Adrian sighed with relief after logging off, though he was spent. In the late afternoon, Eliana showed up without fanfare, wearing casual jeans and a thick sweater. She found him sitting in the study with a look of exhaustion. Concern etched her features. "Long day?" He chuckled ruefully. "You could say that, but it ended better than I expected." She set a small container of homemade soup on the desk and said, "You want to talk about it?" Adrian felt a swell of gratitude. "Maybe later," he said, standing carefully. "For now, let's just enjoy dinner. Tell me something that made you smile today." Eliana's answering grin carried a warmth that outshone all the corporate victories he'd ever claimed. She launched into a story about a young patient who had insisted on singing bedtime songs to the entire ward. Her laughter laced each word, and Adrian found himself smiling so widely that his cheeks hurt. By the time the evening shadows lengthened across the room, he realized that this was the life he wanted, not one defined by endless spreadsheets, but by moments of genuine closeness with the people who mattered. He might still be an influential figure in the boardroom, but he was also a father rediscovering the quiet bliss of shared stories and homemade soup. In a world where so many things remained uncertain, that small certainty felt like a gift he would protect at all costs. Late in the autumn afternoon, clouds drifted across a pale sky as Adrian leaned against the balustrade of his upstairs balcony. A gentle breeze caught the last few leaves tumbling from the maples below. The hush of dusk brought with it a contemplative lull, and he watched the lights flicker on across the sprawling lawn that stretched out around his estate. In the past, this vantage point served as a stage for him to admire his domain, a symbol of all he had achieved. Now, It felt like a quiet perch from which he could see how far he'd come and how much further he wished to go. Downstairs, Eliana was busy in the lounge, reviewing her latest study materials. She had finished another punishing shift at the hospital that morning, catching only a few hours of sleep before coming over, determined to keep to her schedule. Adrian had offered her a permanent space upstairs, one that the decorator had outfitted in soft colors and comfortable furnishings, but she insisted on moving in her own time, preferring for now to keep the arrangement flexible. He respected that. Each day, they edged closer to a genuine father-daughter relationship, one step at a time. His phone buzzed on the rail, jolting him from his thoughts. With a measured sigh, he lifted it to see a message from his CFO. The board had called an emergency meeting for the next afternoon. Rumors of a potential hostile takeover were swirling. An outside investment group had begun quietly buying up shares, and it seemed they were angling for a major shakeup in company leadership. Adrian felt his shoulders tighten. Though he had prepared for the possibility that the board might question his readiness, he hadn't expected an outright threat from external forces. The old reflex kicked in, adrenaline spiking as he remembered the cutthroat tactics he once wielded so effectively. But a new voice rose within him, urging caution and reminding him he no longer stood alone in his battles. He slipped his phone into his pocket and made his way downstairs, following the glow of a lamp into the lounge. Eliana glanced up from her laptop, catching the tension in his expression. "Everything okay?" she asked, concern flickering in her eyes. He settled into a chair across from her, exhaling slowly before answering. "There's trouble brewing at the company. Looks like some outside group is amassing shares, possibly trying to oust our leadership. I have an emergency board meeting tomorrow." She frowned. "Does that mean they're coming for you specifically?" Adrian shrugged. "Very likely. People see vulnerability, they move in." His tone was almost resigned, but behind it lay the slightest quiver of resolve. "I won't go down without a fight, but I need to figure out how to handle this without reverting to my old tactics." Eliana closed her laptop, giving him her full attention. "You've changed, yes, but that doesn't mean you can't protect what's important to you. Maybe you just do it differently this time. Collaboration instead of domination. Empathy instead of intimidation." Adrian offered a tight smile. "Easier said than done. I still have to prove to the board, and to any potential aggressors, that I'm capable." She leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. "I believe in you," she said softly. "Whatever happens, you're not alone." Those words settled warmly in Adrian's chest, as though a missing puzzle piece had finally found its place. Never before had he been so aware of how powerful genuine support could feel. They spent the evening strategizing quietly, Eliana quizzing him on the nature of hostile takeovers, governance rules, and corporate ethics. She didn't pretend to be an expert, but her pointed questions forced him to articulate a plan rooted in transparency and cooperation. By the time they wrapped up, Adrian felt more centered, as if he'd harnessed the drive he used to wield as a weapon and tempered it with the wisdom he'd gained through hardship. Despite the lingering fear, his heart was steadier than it had been in years. The next day dawned gray and chilly, a fitting backdrop for the looming battle in the boardroom. Adrian dressed carefully, choosing a tailored suit that fit over his still-healing frame. Each breath reminded him of the accident's aftermath, but he took it as a sign of perseverance rather than weakness. The driver pulled up to the front entrance, and as Adrian slid into the back seat, he felt a tug of emotion to see Eliana standing near the doorway, offering him a small wave. "Good luck," she mouthed, and he returned the gesture with a nod. He realized with a surge of gratitude that her presence at the mansion made it feel more like a home than it ever had before. Upon arriving at the corporate headquarters, he walked into the boardroom under a hush of apprehensive glances. The air smelled of stale coffee and tension. Around the massive mahogany table, the board members murmured greetings, but the undercurrent of uncertainty was undeniable. At the far end sat a trio of lawyers, presumably representing the investment group that was eyeing a takeover. Once everyone settled, the chairman, an older woman with steel-gray hair, cleared her throat. "We've called this meeting," she began, "because we've received indications that a consortium led by Magnus Equity has been purchasing a significant volume of shares. They've reached a threshold that grants them certain rights, and they've made it clear they have concerns about our leadership." Adrian folded his hands, scanning the room. In the past, he would have unleashed a fiery speech, made sure everyone remembered who built this empire from scratch. But a tempered calm guided him now. "I'm aware of Magnus Equity's tactics," he said, voice resonating with quiet conviction. "They look for perceived weaknesses, and they exploit them. My recent accident might have signaled to them that I can't lead effectively, but let me assure you, that's not the case." A man in a trim suit, one of the Magnus Equity lawyers, raised a brow. "Their official position," he stated, "is that the company lacks a succession plan and remains overly reliant on your personal oversight. In short, they claim the enterprise would benefit from new management." Adrian inhaled, ignoring the stab of annoyance. "Then let's correct their misconception. I've spent the last weeks implementing a more collaborative leadership model. My senior team is empowered and fully capable, with me as a guiding figure rather than an autocrat. We're pivoting towards sustainable, socially conscious initiatives, which I believe will position us competitively for the future." The man smirked. "Noble goals. But Magnus Equity wants assurances that returns won't suffer in the name of altruism." Adrian maintained eye contact, unflinching. Profits and social responsibility aren't mutually exclusive. If anything, shifting toward ethical and community-focused projects can enhance our reputation, leading to long-term gains. I'm willing to present a detailed plan proving it. A flicker of movement caught Adrian's eye. Some of the board members exchanged glances, as though suddenly seeing him in a new light. Behind the scenes, they might have expected him to hunker down, to revert to his old tactics of intimidation. Instead, he was showing a measured willingness to adapt. For the next hour, the debate raged. Magnus Equity's representatives pressed for more concessions, questioning each growth strategy. Adrian countered with data, calmly and thoroughly. He invited his CFO and other executives to speak, highlighting how decisions were being shared across leadership. It became clear that the company was no longer a one-man show, and though the transition was still in progress, it undermined the argument that everything rode on Adrian's singular force of will. By the end of the meeting, the lawyers looked less assured, forced to concede that Magnus Equity might not find it easy to unseat a leader whose greatest perceived weakness, his personal crisis, had become a catalyst for a more robust organizational model. When the conference adjourned, a collective exhale swept through the boardroom. Some members approached Adrian, expressing relief. The sense of unity was cautious but genuine. As he left the room, he felt an unfamiliar buoyancy in his chest. Perhaps Magnus Equity wouldn't disappear overnight, but they were no longer an immediate threat. And in that victory, Adrian found a validation that he could protect his legacy without sacrificing his new principles. Returning to the mansion, he found Eliana in the kitchen, stirring a pot of pasta sauce on the stovetop. The savory aroma wafted through the foyer. She looked up, eyes filled with anticipation. "How'd it go?" she asked, pausing in her culinary efforts. Adrian set his briefcase aside, shrugging off his coat with a small wince. "Better than I feared," he admitted. "I made my case and the board's on board, at least for now. Magnus Equity won't be seizing control anytime soon." Eliana's face lit up. "That's amazing," she said, turning off the burner. "You must be relieved." He moved closer, inhaling the tang of tomatoes and herbs. Relieved, yes, he replied, and a bit exhausted. But mostly I'm proud that I didn't just charge in, guns blazing. I listened to my team, trusted them to help. It's new for me. Eliana nodded, ladling sauce into a bowl. There's strength in knowing you don't have to do it all alone. Her remark stirred a profound resonance in him. A memory flickered of the nights he'd once spent in solitary triumph, celebrating business victories in an empty house. How different it felt to come home now, with someone who genuinely cared. Indeed, he said quietly. And I owe that realization, in large part, to you. They shared dinner at the small breakfast nook overlooking the garden. Lights twinkled beyond the windows, and a soft hush enveloped the house that once seemed too large for one soul. As they spoke, their conversation meandered through life's everyday details. Eliana's next shift, a new painting Adrian was thinking of purchasing, the possibility of hosting a modest get-together for a handful of close colleagues. Each topic was unremarkable in itself, yet together they formed the tapestry of a relationship built on honesty and mutual respect. Later, as they cleared the dishes, Adrian paused at the kitchen sink, glancing over at Eliana. "This feels good," he said, letting the warmth in his tone speak volumes. "I never realized how much I wanted this. Just someone to share the small things with." She looked at him, a gentle smile curving her lips. "We still have a long way to go," she reminded him softly. "But I'm here, if you'll have me in your life." His throat tightened with emotion. "Always," he said, setting down a plate. "You're my daughter. That's not something I'll ever take for granted again." The simple sincerity of his words seemed to bridge the years they had lost. Though the future would doubtless hold challenges, Adrian understood that fatherhood, and this new phase of his personal and professional life, was not about perfection. It was about presence, about letting someone in, about finding a purpose beyond the relentless race for success. The evening ended in companionable quiet. Eliana retreated to the guest wing to rest, while Adrian stepped onto the back patio for a final breath of night air. The moon hung low over the garden, tracing pale silver lines across the neatly trimmed hedges. He closed his eyes, recalling all that had transpired, from the car accident that nearly took his life to the shocking discovery that had given it new meaning. For too long, he believed the only legacy that mattered was the empire he had built. Now he knew better. In a world where fortunes rose and fell, where hostile takeovers lurked, and accidents could steal everything in an instant, the real treasure lay in the bonds formed with those we cared about. He pictured Carmen's smile, softly superimposed on the memory of Eliana's steady gaze. The two women he'd failed in different ways, yet each had gifted him with the chance to grow beyond his limitations. As he turned to head inside, he felt a lightness in his chest, a stirring of gratitude and hope. The mansion's shadows no longer felt so imposing. Tomorrow's dawn would bring fresh challenges, but Adrian knew he wouldn't face them alone. With the daughter he had almost lost by his side, he would forge a new chapter guided by compassion, humility, and the belief that family could transcend even the deepest scars of the past.